As the hitting intensifies, it's 1-0 Montreal. On a power play for another 50 seconds. Richards trying to scoot in there alone. Halak way out of the net. It pinballs to the crease. Score! Mike Richards!
The Flyer captain is announcing his presence as the alpha male early in this one. Big hit. Sets up that cranker from Coburn, the defenseman joining the attack. They win a puck deep in their own zone. Hammerlick and the goaltender Halak collide. Oh, did they ever. And it's a tap in for Richards.
Everybody, it's Isaiah, and I'm here with Chef B, who's going to tell us about one of our sponsors here. Chef?
Yeah, O&B Puckcast is now brought to you by Summit Public Adjusters. The winter months can be especially hard on our homes, from roof damage and peeling siding to frozen pipes and toilet overflows. Call Summit Public Adjusters before you call your insurance company. Dealing with your insurance company can be stressful and confusing. Let Summit Public Adjusters take the stress out of the claim process by having our guys work for you. Get the most for your money and your repairs. The next time the big snow or the rain leaves you with some home damage, contact us for a free consultation. Summit Public Adjusters are licensed in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Learn more at summitpublicadjusters.com or call 215-752-0560. Just tell them that the chef sent you.
Yeah, what was that number again, Chef?
215-752-0560.
That's terrific. All right, we're going to carry on with the rest of our show. And we are back. It is Isaiah, your host. Today we have an O&B Puckcast special brought to you by FlyersNittyGritty.com. As usual, we're going to move some of the housekeeping back because a week ago we did a show called Flyers on a Roll. Playoffs are the goal. And now the Flyers and their fans have gone from that somewhat high to with a near perfect game versus Dallas to losing 3 in a row at home. The Owen Tippett injury, it could have been worse, but he's going to be out until after the All-Star break. And now Carter Hart's leave of absence, which by all appearances is related to the 2018 Hockey Canada sexual assault allegations that we've referred to for quite a while now. And that's it looks like a 180-degree downturn of fortune in just 6-7 days. And this is coming after the Gauthier-Drysdale situation. But they have another challenge in front of them. And to help us navigate that, as we tell you that Chef B and Dan Silver are not able to make this morning recording. But we do have Anthony DiMarco from thefourthperiod.com to join us. Anthony, welcome aboard.
Looking forward to today, man. Obviously, a lot of material to break down here.
Yeah, there really is. So from the national perspective, you up in Canada, I wanted to get that on our show because I felt it was really important. The Flyers have been engaged in a lot of messaging lately about what their future is and things like that. We can get to that. Give us a summary of how you see things right now lining up with what we know. We know that there's certain fact patterns in terms of 5 players have taken a leave of absence from their teams. One of them is over in Europe. It just so happens that the London police are asking 5 members of that team to turn themselves in for face charges of sexual alleged impropriety. Take it from there.
Well, look, I mean, a lot of dot connecting has been going on here, but until it's officially addressed or there have been official charges, it's really tough to speculate on. obviously you have guys like Formanton, Dylan Dubé, who actually kind of went under the mental health gauze, if you will. Michael McLeod and Cal Foote from the New Jersey Devils, and obviously Carter Hart, all taking leave of absences within a week of each other. And then coincidentally, yesterday, we get the announcement from the London police force that 5 players are being asked to surrender to their headquarters. And then we get the announcement that on the Monday following the NHL All-Star break, which is kind of convenient for the NHL that this is all going to come to a head following the All-Star festivities wrapping up, that we are going to get a press conference. So, I mean, they're beyond dot connecting, and I guess you could kind of say some low-hanging fruit. You can't really say anything in terms of the investigation and potential involvements. But from an on-ice perspective, it's left these teams in a tough spot. You know, save for Formanton, who's been playing overseas. You have the Flames, the Devils, and the Flyers. And in the Flames' case, 2 players active on their rosters, taking up roster spots, eating up cap space, and will be doing so for an indefinite period of time. And I spoke to 2 general managers yesterday, and they both told me like they don't know exactly how this is going to go for any of these teams, even for some GMs who have no skin in the game here. GMs who don't even don't have players on these teams don't know how these specific teams are going to be working through this this, I guess, uncharted water situation. I've had some people suggest to me that it's going to be similar about when you put someone on a non-roster if they get checked into the rehab, the NHL PA assistance program. But all this to say, for the Philadelphia Flyers, Calgary Flames, New Jersey Devils, it's completely uncharted waters and unfamiliar territory from a hockey perspective. But obviously, there's a lot of speculation that this could go way beyond hockey, although it is important to reiterate that nothing is official yet.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've heard some speculation that there's nothing they can do in terms of roster spots, cap space, or anything until formal charges would be made. Well, not charges, but any kind of conviction would happen. And then there's a possibility that a contract could be voided or something, but we're a ways away from that right now. So everything's up in limbo, like you said. What's not in limbo is the Flyers have a season to play. They have 2 more games before the All-Star break. Samuel Ersson, who many felt was outplaying Carter Hart, in the balance of the season, is now going to take over the reins of the number 1 job. And then there's the question of, well, how's this going to work out with Cal Peterson being the first candidate to be the backup? And of course, Samuel Ersson has played very well. He shows a lot of promise. Daniel Briere was out in front of the press yesterday talking about how eventually he feels like Samuel Ersson does have what it takes to be a number 1, but he only has 35 games of NHL experience, and you don't want to rush him into that. So what does that mean for the season, and how often that this guy's going to play versus someone like him or maybe Felix Sandstrom?
Yeah, you know what? It's funny because Jason and I, when we do our show, we would talk a lot about some questions we would get regarding, should the Flyers explore trade Carter Hart? Should you sell high on Samuel Ersson? And Jay always says the same thing. You have goaltending depth until you don't. And the Flyers, I would say, were the deepest this year at the goaltending position, arguably ever in my lifetime watching them. Like going 4 deep with Sandstrom and Peterson as your 3-4s was pretty good in today's NHL, where so many teams struggle to ice just competent goaltending. Look no further than the not the Calgary Flames, the Carolina Hurricanes and the New Jersey Devils. You take out Carter Hart, and all of a sudden that goaltending picture looks kind of bleak. And I was kind of surprised that they elected to call up Peterson over Sandstrom, because I know in the past I've been told that they feel that Sandstrom can be a competent backup. But I think that you've discussed as well is that I think Sandstrom has struggled at times to just come in spot duty like a traditional backup and give you solid starts. Peterson obviously has a lot more of a track record in the NHL. I think he's been somewhat better than Sandstrom in Lehigh Valley, although I don't think either have been particularly good. And to your point, Ersson's been really, really good the last 2 months, but that's all it is. It's 2 months of play for Samuel Ersson when he's been kind of platooning in that role with Carter Hart. Now there's not going to be a platoon anymore. This is Samuel Ersson's net. Like, I don't think that they're going to be splitting this 50-50, let alone 60-40. Like, I think that you're maybe going to see Samuel Ersson here get 7 out of 10 starts. And that's just speculation on my part. I haven't been told that. But I mean, Cal Peterson, his numbers the last 2 seasons are what they are. You know, he was a promising goalie right up until 2021, and he's been on a steady decline since then. And there's a reason why LA signed him to that contract in the first place, and then there's a reason why they dumped him after that. And look, he's come in 2 games this year, sub 900 save percentage, 3.5 goals against average. You know, I think his play somewhat turned around with Lehigh Valley, but at this point, the Flyers pretty much don't have 2 goalies that they can rely on any given night anymore. This is really Samuel Ersson's net, and you just have to hope that Cal Peterson doesn't completely sink you when he goes in there.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a different theory here. I think the Flyers have not gotten a lot out of Peterson and Sandstrom down in Lehigh Valley. But neither one of them has kind of really grabbed the reins. My thought process is they brought back Sandstrom and really wanted to bring him back for a reason, because they anticipated something like this was possible with Carter Hart. Yep. Now, I think they're going to try and see if Sandstrom can get a good run down in Lehigh Valley. Meanwhile, they have Peterson, who is who he is. He's probably not going to change. And if they feel that Sandstrom can do a better job, they can demote Peterson, run him and that contract through waivers, and then Sandstrom can play the rest of the year. And if the Flyers make the playoffs, he would be their backup goalie. But without a good run of play to establish himself, and he really hasn't done that, they might as well have Peterson up here. But Peterson would be easier to get through waivers if they change their mind. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, it's actually a very good point. And, you know, if you're going to invest in one guy getting on a roll here, it would be Sandstrom. Now, do I think that Sandstrom has a crazy future with the Flyers? Not particularly. He's already 27 years old. He's a pending UFA. We know the goaltending depth that the Flyers have in their system, even beyond Ivan Fedotov with Kolosov and Bjarnason and the other kid that they took this past year. Like, I don't think that Sandstrom really has a path here to be at best anything more than the backup goaltender for another year or 2 at the NHL level. But at the same time, I think you kind of know what you have in Peterson. Well, maybe there still is a little left to squeeze out of Felix Sandstrom. And to your point, who's going to get claimed on waivers if either? It's going to be Sandstrom 100%. So you want to give him that runway. Now he's the undisputed guy with the Lehigh Valley Phantoms. And if you have to have one guy sit on the bench and only play once every 2 weeks or whatever it is, especially with the All-Star break coming up, you're going to want Felix Sandstrom to play that role. So, yeah, I think that's 100% true. I do think the fact of Peterson at least being more experienced in a somewhat backup role does play a bit of a factor here, because I think that Sandstrom never really like last year was his first year as a backup in the NHL, or as a consistent NHLer period. And I think that he had a lot of natural talent. I think his reactions are very, very sound, but I think he struggled to just come in without being able to get on a roll and go a game without giving up a leaky goal. So, I mean, now you're going to give him a stretch of games here as the undisputed starter with the Phantoms. And I do think your theory is well-founded. And look, at the end of the day, like I said earlier, if you have to give one guy a shot to get his game together, you're going to invest in Sandstrom over Cal Peterson every day of the week.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's Samuel Ersson's net. We don't know what's going to happen with Carter Hart, but as you mentioned, the Flyers have been investing in this position for a long time. And who knows? We have our Dan Silver is over in Russia right now. And he said he wanted to kidnap, Mishkov and Kolosov to make sure they'll get over here. And I told him, hey, if you're closer to where Fedotov is out, we'll take him. But yeah, he's out there. He's going to be going for a little while. But yeah, the Flyers have been investing in this position in anticipation of that and just wanting to have more depth, because we saw it fell down last year in Lehigh Valley. They didn't really have a lot of options when they took on some injuries. So they're in a better spot to go forward with this. And this reminds us, this is a rebuilding year. This has been a year of some bumps. And people have to realize that the Flyers, at least in this circumstance, had some notice that this was possible. And I think some contingencies are in place with the drafting and bringing Sandstrom back, and maybe under the guise of the scenario that played out the way I thought it might. But, the team has to move forward, Anthony, and they've lost 3 games in a row after, what was it, a 5 or 6 game winning streak, topped off by that great game versus Dallas. It was probably their best game of the year. And now to have this downer, and then on top of that, with Hart leaving and all that uncertainty and maybe really ominous outcome for him, what are you looking for from this team as they play 2 more games before the All-Star break tonight in Detroit? And then they have another one. There was matinees where they generally don't play well against the Boston Bruins, who are probably one of the top 2 or 3 teams in the entire league.
You know what? It may sound cliche, but I just hope to see them stick to their process, because even against the Tampa Bay Lightning, I didn't find that they played particularly bad. And correct me if I'm wrong, Isaiah, was that just not a game that the team with elite high-end talent came through because of that elite high-end talent? Is that what you saw?
Yeah, I mean, that and Colorado. I mean, I think the Flyers played territorially. And if you look at the analytics, in a circumstance where the high-end talent made the difference. For Colorado, it was as much on the power play and 5-on-5. For Tampa, it was almost exclusively on the power play. I mean, once they got that opportunity, they're high-end guys, which are far and above anything the Flyers have. It made the difference. And that's the idea behind having that level of talent. When you have elite level players like McKinnon or Kucherov, you can have an off night, but you give that guy a chance and he's going to convert, and you're not going to get that from the Flyers lineup. So they have that slack, that margin of error. And this is why the Flyers have recently been discussing and coming out with tweets and interviews with Briere yesterday, his availability, and Keith Jones with the PHLY people we're talked about. We're sticking with our process, our plan, because you see what these other teams are capable of doing on an off night. And the only way to get that talent is to stick with the kind of rebuild where we can acquire that talent. Now, whether that comes through the draft, free agency, or through trade, we don't know. But if you're expending resources that you could use in one way or another to just band-aid your way into the playoffs, you're never going to make it.
Well, exactly that. And, I spoke to someone after the Flyers lost to Colorado, and he told me that is a game where you played 2 players in Makar and McKinnon that at a flip of a switch, they can take over. And that was the difference, is that you have 2 guys on that team that could take over a game and are probably 2 of the top 5 players in the entire world. Then you play a team like the Tampa Bay Lightning last night that, after their second line, I don't think they're anything special. I think if you go into the bottom 6, the Flyers match up against them arguably better at times because of their process and their work ethic. But when you have guys like Kucherov, when you have guys like Braden Point, Hedman on the back end, the Vasilevsky and net, I thought he was the main reason why the Lightning held a lead through the first half of that game. The cream rises to the top. And that's not to say that the Flyers, completely dominated them, but I thought they hung right with them and arguably played better with them territorially at times. But to your point, aside, like, the Flyers don't have anything that remotely matches the level of the aforementioned Tampa Bay players. And in games like that, that's what's going to come to the top. And, you look at a team like the Dallas Stars, who, in a way, if you kind of think about it, they're like the best version of what the Flyers could be. Like, they don't have a superstar either.
Yeah, like Heiskanen is like a notch below Makar. I'd take him, don't get me wrong, but
yeah, exactly. Like or Rupe Hintz, he's a first line center, but he's not McKinnon, he's not Point, he's not Kucherov. So, like, if you're kind of if you're the Flyers, you're probably kind of looking at the Dallas Stars as like a model that you could build off of. Just a good process team that you have a bunch of higher end players, but no like complete standalone superstar. And I think that that's why when you see the Flyers play teams like the Dallas Stars or even the Vegas Golden Knights for that matter, like, okay, Jack Eichel is probably like a borderline top 10 player in the NHL, but he's no McKinnon, he's no Kucherov, he's no Point.
Right.
That's why they're able to beat teams like that, teams that don't have that complete outlandish superstar. Even the Winnipeg Jets, they're another team that, yes, you have Scheifele, you have Ehlers, you have Josh Morrissey, but none of these
Hellebuck.
guys
Yeah,
are
Hellebuck's
like
probably
that
the best
top.
overall. Yeah.
Exactly. And it seems to me that they only seem to lose these games when they play the teams with the high-end superstars like the McKinnons and the Kucherovs and the Makars and even the Austin Matthews of the world or Connor McDavid. We saw it happen in Edmonton as well, where we saw the Connor McDavid show. And it's because when you face off a player of that ilk and that tier and that caliber, and they start to get cooking and they start dancing like McDavid did or McKinnon did or Makar did, the Flyers don't have a player right now that can offset that. Now, maybe if you're built like the Vegas Golden Knights and you're built like the Dallas Stars, where you have, good talent through and through, maybe through your depth and your work ethic, you can kind of offset that. But the Flyers aren't quite where the Knights and the Stars are. And I think that's where you really see where the Flyers have work to do.
Yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, the aforementioned teams are kind of like the 06 Hurricanes or the 2019 St. Louis Blues. There's just depth all throughout the lineup.
07 Ducks too.
Although I think with Niedermeyer and Pronger, I mean, yes, two Hall of Famers there. Yeah, that's pretty that's pretty nasty. But we have to see it. Just like the Flyers have Michkov, and we hope Michkov can be kind of like a cross between like a Kucherov and a Rantanen, maybe probably more like Kucherov. I think Rantanen's a great player too. I mean, you go back to 15, just an aside, and I was looking. You ever do the Internet Hockey Database, and you go through the draft and like, who the Flyers should have taken? Everybody does it, right? Everybody's an arm jam.
Well, it's actually funny you bring that up because I was speaking to a few people yesterday, just kind of shooting the shit hockey conversations, and obviously the whole talk of the Flyers wanting Heiskanen over Nolan Patrick came up. But it was also that apparently the scouts wanted Rantanen over Ivan Provorov. So imagine a timeline where the Flyers took Rantanen and Heiskanen instead of Provorov and Nolan Patrick. And look, I think the Provorov one, like in real time, I remember being happy with that. And I think that there was a period where you could have justified that, like up until the pandemic, where Provorov was the right pick and he was trending towards being a number one defenseman. But obviously, where the chips have fallen since the pandemic, imagine a world where the Flyers had Mikko Rantanen and Miro Heiskanen on this team.
Yep. I know. As much as we criticize what Ron Hextall did here, there were critical moments and draft picks that he made that just altered everything. And had he just made other choices that were realistic and in range, I'm not even talking about like they took Konechny. That was a fine pick. If they had taken Aho, it would have been better. But most people didn't have Aho quite at that level, even though they're not that far apart. So you can give them some slack. But if you're talking about the Provorov, the Rantanen, or the Heiskanen versus Patrick, that's a conversation you can have.
Well, it's not even so much like though. At least you could say Konechny was a legit NHLer, or I've heard Dan Silver talk about Sanheim and Pasternak, or the even the Patrick one. Like it is kind of revisionist history because he was supposed to be the number one guy even up until the draft floor. We didn't know if it was going to be he, share him. But I look a lot at 2016. When they had 4 picks inside the top 2 rounds. And yes, you walk away with Carter Hart, 48th overall, I believe it was. But, you take Pascal Laberge, you take German Rubtsov, you take Wade Allison and you, not to say that 2016 was like a star-studded draft aside from, let's say, Matthews going first overall, but you
Right.
look at just some of the guys that they passed on, whether that be, Tage Thompson in the first round or Alex DeBrincat in the second, and also Dylan Dubé, Philip Gustafson, Philip Hronek. Like, it's not to say that you got to hit on all of them, and I know you get Carter Hart, but to strike out on 3 of the 4 in the top 2 rounds, like, that was supposed to be a big turning year. That was Hextall's 3rd draft. You had 3 picks in the top 2 rounds. And again, it was a common theme of, and this is not to, turn back the clock and to 2018 and go on a Ron Hextall smear campaign. But
Yeah.
I mean, you take 3 guys that all are of the high floor, low ceiling ilk. And, I think maybe that's one of the reasons why we tried to pump the tires of Wade Allison for so long, because he was the one guy of that class, of the non-goalie cut, that we were trying to hold out hope for.
Yeah. I mean, there were a lot of strikeouts in that draft. It wasn't, I mean, you look at the landscape, and remember, I think the Flyers trade down to 22 at that point.
Yeah,
But
yeah, they
if
did.
you look at Luke Cunnin, or Jacob Chikrin was a good player. Dante Fabro looks like he's on his way. But when the Flyers started drafting, I think they had 18 or 19. I forget which one it was.
Yeah, and
But
everyone wanted them to take Bellows.
Bellows, right? They had Logan Stanley, Kiefer Bellows, Dennis Cholowski, Julian Gauthier. Then you have Rubtsov. There's not a lot there. Max Jones, really nothing. I mean, the first player that broke out
Tage.
was Tage Thompson. It's
Yeah.
it really, you made more hay in the second round in terms of value.
Oh,
Everybody,
yeah. Well, the second
Kyrou,
round is
to
where,
Brink it, yeah.
yeah, you have DeBrincat, you have Philip Hronek, Philip Gustafson, Dylan Dubé. Again, it's not a crazy great draft, but it's more just the I guess the common theme of that draft, because then you go into the 3rd round, they take Carson Twarynski. You go into the 4th round, they take Connor Bunnaman. Then then you go into the 6th round, you take Tanner Lazinski. Like, those are like 4 of the same players over
Right.
and over and over again. Like, even when they were drafted, I don't think anyone projected Twarynski, Bunnaman, or Lazinski to be anything more than decent 3rd liners in the NHL.
Or
And I think,
organizational depth in
yeah,
the
and,
AHL.
and it was as if Ron Hextall drafted with the assumption that Giroux and Voracek were going to be superstars for an indefinite period of time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I mean, we're 2 regimes later, so don't want to get too hung up
And
on
thank
it.
God for that. And that's part of the upturn here. I mean, the Flyers are still 25-17-6, even though they're 1-3 since our last episode, which we discussed. They have I think they're in 3rd place right now in the Metro. There are 34 games remaining, and there are 15 games before the trade deadline. So, look, they're going to be made or broken right here. What effect do you think, based on your sourcing, if any, that this Hart situation will have on the Flyers' trade deadline strategy? Because if you listen to Daniel Briere, not much.
Yeah, I don't think it changes much, because this wasn't a team that, let's assume Carter Hart was still with the club and would have remained with the club through the season. I don't think that this was ever a situation where the Flyers were going to push all their chips in the middle and be like, yeah, you know what, we're going to go for it. This is a cup contending team. I think the only thing that may have changed this year, because of the way the team has played, is that they weren't going to cut the legs out from them. Like, they weren't just going to start trading off pieces like Sealer for a 4th round pick, Walker for a 3rd, retain on Risto and trade him for a 3rd, like stuff like that. I think that they became more conscious of what kind of effect that would have on the culture of the team. But with Carter Hart out, like, I don't think it changes much either, because you still have Ersson, who's playing well. This is still a team that, despite a 3-game losing streak, they're still playing well process-wise. Yes, they've dropped 3 in a row. The Ottawa one you certainly want to have back, but
Yeah,
we
that
already
was a bad one.
discussed what the obstacles were playing against teams like the Avalanche and the Lightning, and the star power you just simply can't match at this point in time. But I think that you're going to see the Flyers really look here to just maybe not tread water is the right word, but I do think that you're going to see Walker moved because I think he's a guy that can fetch a return that not is going to bite you in the backside because maybe a second round pick isn't going to change the trajectory of your team, but more in the sense of like that's a pick that you can maybe parlay into something else that will help you. And I do think the Flyers are going to look here to maybe add a depth forward or a forward that could project to help them in the future that fits that age range, specifically down the middle. Like maybe
Paling type.
Yeah, like a Paling type. Like one name that I've heard tossed around a bit lately that I think the Flyers could explore, and I know that other teams kind of like the idea as well, is Cody Glass with the Nashville Predators. Like he's playing second line with them right now between Thomas Novak and I believe Evangelista. But I think he has 2 points through 19 games, has struggled to find traction after a decent season last year with them. He's dealt with injuries as well, but 24 years old. He's from that 2017 Nolan Patrick draft. I think good size, 6'4", I believe. Now, this isn't me saying that they're speaking about Cody Glass or Nashville's ready to trade him, but I think those are the types of players that if they're going to add, it'll be something like that because that they want to address the center ice position. I believe Keith Jones alluded to it with Charlie O'Connor and Bill Matz on that podcast. Like it's so obvious. It's such a gaping hole, especially with Cutter Gauthier out of the mix. So I think aside from moving on from a Sean Walker and maybe looking for a reclamation project like that, it will be a relatively quiet deadline for the Flyers.
Yeah. I could definitely see that. Sealer, I have heard they kind of are biased toward signing him if something could be worked out in terms of term and AAV that meets their timeline. But they're not necessarily committed one way or another. Is that what you're getting?
I mean, I know that they like Nick Sealer. He's good for the culture. I think it's going to depend on what the cap number is. One thing that I would, and this is me more just speculating, but it is somewhat based on conversation I've had. Like, I don't know if you're going to see Nick Sealer traded by himself for like a 4th round draft pick. I don't think that is something that they would want to explore. We have heard the rumblings that there's at least one team that inquired about him and Sean Walker and the price being set at a 1st round pick. I would venture to guess that team is the Toronto Maple Leafs, but I could also tell you that Toronto Maple Leafs don't have much to give, and anything they worth having to give is they're not willing to part with. And I've heard that from teams, not just from the Flyers. I know that Toronto has really kind of pissed off some teams with their coy approach and not being serious in trade talks. I think with Nick Sealer, you're at a point where you have an undersized / not physical blue line at the top end. And Sealer, along with Risto, are the only guys that kind of provide that type of play. So if you move on from Nick Sealer, what are you going to be left with? Are you going to be left with just Risto, who plays that role? And I think that is something that somewhat concerns the Flyers. Yes, you have good puck movers in Sanheim and Drysdale and York, and I think Zamula's game is trending well in that direction. But I do think that they feel like, is it worth moving on from Sealer for a 4th round pick, or is it better to keep him around for the intangibles and the style of play that he brings? Like, look how many shots he blocked last game. I think Danny Briere even alluded to it in his media availability. He does play a role and diversifies that blue line. Like him and Risto are guys that provide important elements, easy enough for me to say, to that back end, especially if you go into a playoff series. Like we saw what kind of size Vegas's blue line had, or the type of guys that the Avalanche had behind Taves and Makar and Manson and Jack and Eric Johnson. Like you need those types of players. So I think for the Flyers, their kind of worry is, are you going to just move on from a Nick Sealer, just have Ristolainen, and then you have a blue line that might get pushed around come playoff time?
Hence their possible interest mentioned by Elliot Freeman of Arbor Jackeye from Montreal, which the Habs apparently were not interested in moving him, but he's that kind of player as well.
Yeah, it's funny. When did Elliot mention that on
his last 32 Thoughts? I think I posted that on Monday. I think that's when it was.
Directly to the Flyers?
In the milieu, he didn't say it had anything to do with Gauthier directly, But when the Flyers are out there making inquiries, apparently they were, and this means apparently, it's not definitely, although he did mention it, didn't he? The Flyers were one of the teams that inquired on Jack Guy.
Well, I can tell you it's kind of funny that we bring this up today. The Flyers do like Arbor Jack Guy a lot, and I would say that they spoke to Montreal heavily about flipping Frost for Arbor Jack Guy. And I think that's something that Montreal didn't have interest in, and they're not moving Arbor Jack Guy. Montreal told the Flyers that they're not moving Arbor Jack Guy, but I think that the Flyers, to your point, like the idea of bringing in a guy like Jack Guy because that's someone who fits your age timeline, and then maybe that makes a guy like Nick Seeler expendable from an on-ice perspective. And if you bring in Jack Guy and you compare him with a Drysdale and then go back to a York Sanheim pairing, and I think that the Flyers, Tortorella specifically, prefer Travis Sanheim on the right side, I think all of a sudden you have a more sustainable looking top four here because of the guys that you just kind of like outlined. So, I mean, I do think the size on that back end is something that they're very not concerned about, but cognizant of. And I think for them, maybe Seeler and Zamula can be bridges to guys like Hunter McDonald and Oliver Bonk in 2-3 years' time. Like I know Keith Jones mentioned it on the podcast with Charlie and Bill that he went out of his way to point out Hunter McDonald, and a lot of people even outside the Flyers organization have gone out of their way to point out Hunter McDonald to me, and they feel that he's 2 years away, and Bonk is 2 or 3 years away, and those are two guys who are bigger, physical. I think McDonald is much more on the nastier side. So I think for them, you're not going to go into the playoffs or even into a season with only one guy who plays that role. So I think for them, if you can't bring in a Jack Guy, you're going to hang on to Seeler to play that role. So, I mean, I know a lot of people might roll their eyes like, oh, Broad Street Bullies, this and that, but the proof is in the pudding. The Montreal Canadiens, in addition to Carey Price, arguably went to the Cup final 3 years ago because of those four monsters they had on the back end with Sherratt, Weber, Edmondson, and Jeff Petrie. So there is something to it, and I think that it is fair to say that aside from Seeler and Risto, it's a rather undersized and non-physical blue line that the Flyers have.
Yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, Jones, like you mentioned, articulated that he does like size on the blue line, but you have to have mobility. And this speaks to the idea that you don't want to just collect talent. You want to build a team. So the puzzle pieces have to fit together. And pursuit of those kind of players, as long as they are accommodating or have accommodated to the modern game, as opposed to what we picture even 20 years ago, these players can make sense in combination with the right partners. So as we move along, the Flyers, according to Money Puck, have a 77% chance of making the playoffs still. I like their chances. And this is, Anthony, one other thing. We have guys like Mark Stahl and other veterans that are here. And we talk about the veteran presence and things like that. Isn't a situation that the Flyers are encountering right now with Carter Hart a classic example where these younger guys are kind of like in shock. Their buddy could be in big legal trouble. And if he did something, deservedly so. Okay. I don't want anybody to get the wrong impression, but having these veterans there, this is what veteran presence is really all about.
Yeah, for sure. Like I know in an analytical world, we often roll our eyes about the whole intangibles, veteran presence type of thing. But I mean, you're bang on. This is why you have veterans on this team. And I think Danny Briere alluded to it yesterday about what guys like Hathaway and Mark Stahl and Delorier have, Sean Walker, Nick Seeler, what kind of impact they've had on younger players. And there's a ton of young players on the Flyers roster, a bunch of guys 25 and younger. And even for a guy like Mark Stahl, who is effectively the eighth defenseman on this team right now, I mean, would you rather have Mark Stahl sitting in the press box and providing intangibles and veteran leadership? Or would you rather have, Louis Belpedio or Ronnie Addard? Would you rather have, I guess Wade Allison or Bobby Brink sitting in the press box, or Nick Delorier? Like, I think I think the way the Flyers have handled their veterans this year is about as good as you can, because a lot of people said, Mark Stahl is going to bury Zamula and Delorier is going to bury guys like Lexell and Forster. And it's been the opposite. I think that John Tortorella has really proven that even though veterans may get the first kick at the can, if you can't keep up with the pace, you're not going to play. And I do think that there is a heavy intangible and veteran effect behind the scenes that's gone on this year. Like, you've heard John Tortorella say things that it's like the most special group he's coached. And look, we've been tracking this team, well, you much longer than me, but like ever since Holmgren stepped aside, I would say that this is the best team, just from an outsider perspective, that I've seen that's gelled. I haven't seen a team gel this much probably since 2011, 2012, since the last year where Pronger was the captain and ultimately got hurt. Right. Like, this is a team that, just from an optics point of view, process-wise, has not played this well. They had a solid stretch under AV right before the pandemic hit, that 2-month stretch where they were playing really good fundamental hockey. But even that took some time. Like, how long did it take AV to rein that team in and play good process-wise?
Probably till around the holidays.
Yeah.
And they had like a 6-week run where they were very consistent and it looked like a contender. And then it really became unraveled in the bubble. They were outplayed even in the series that they won versus Montreal and against the Islanders. That was a very bad matchup for them, the way they were constructed. And then we all know what happened after that.
Yeah, it's what happened in the bubble is very, very, it's something that I think showed a big indictment on the players. And I was talking to a buddy about this, and he was saying to me, like, and we've known each other for 25 years. I grew up a Flyers fan. He grew up a Bruins fan. And he said, like, isn't it just a damning indictment on the Flyers' old core as to how this team turned around when they moved out all those pieces? Because if you look at this team, this is essentially the Chuck Fletcher team of last year minus a few guys. Mm-hmm. Like, save for Sean Walker, and Sean Couturier has been good since coming back. But right. These are essentially more or less the Chuck Fletcher team. But you've subtracted Ivan Provorov, you subtracted Kevin Hayes, you subtracted Claude Giroux, you subtracted Shane Gostisbehere, you subtracted Jake Voracek. Like, rewind to the beginning of the AV era. Who were wearing letters? Giroux, Voracek, Hayes, Provorov. All those 4 guys are gone now. And all of a sudden, this is a team that looks worlds better than that team that on paper should have blown this team out of the water, honestly. And look, I'm not one to kind of crap all over Claude Giroux and how he was as a captain, because we don't know what went on behind closed doors. But if you just look at objective results of what's happened, I always said that, yes, AV checked out, and towards the end, he clearly didn't give a damn. But I always said that it did not make sense to me how fast that they turned on AV, who got them playing the best fundamental hockey since the Peter Laviolette days. So for me, it looks like this season specifically is a pretty damning indictment on the prior core group of guys and the 4 guys who wore letters on this team.
Well, I mean, the Flyers had a reputation in that era just a few years ago of being very sensitive, complaining, easy to get under their skin. They were big complainers on the ice. And then once the top level leadership group started complaining, the other players followed suit. So, but I'm a big believer also that the fish rots from the head down. So for me, everything had to stop being the way it was with the Comcast and Dave Scott and Fletcher just was afraid to say the word rebuild. And that sums up his tenure. Fair as that, or unfair as that may be, that's really, to me, I mean, it was filtered down. And then the coaching It's almost like, look, AV was a good coach. He didn't forget how to coach, but look, he's not coaching anymore. He got burned out by the whole pandemic and that set of circumstances. But I do think you're right. I think that group that came in, as much as we love some of those guys, and Simmons was, to me, was always stuck out as a little bit different, and it would have been
when he left. When he left, it felt that a lot changed.
Yeah.
Like if you had kept Wayne, okay, and obviously the wheels fell off of him as well when he went to New Jersey and Buffalo and Toronto. Like there wasn't a lot of tread left on that tires. I'm not saying that they should have re-signed Wayne Simmons, but when he left, what wasn't his last game, the Stadium Series, where he had that speech in the room where he said, "Let's keep this thing going, boys," and whatever. Yeah. When he left, it felt like a piece of that team, that leadership got ripped out. And I always wondered, like when you had Giroux as the captain, and I believe Simmons and Strite were wearing letters, like it felt different. Like that first year of Hackstall, when they went on that crazy run in March and they got in, that felt like a team on the ascent because they had a good leadership, but they were lacking that talent.
Was that 18?
It was 15, 16.
Oh,
it was the first year of Dave Hackstall. It was the second year of Ron Hextall.
Gotcha.
You had Simmons wearing a letter. You had Mark Strite wearing a letter. I remember that was the year that Nick Cousins was pretty good on this team. It was the rookie year. Shane Gostisbehere. Michael Delzato was actually a pretty good contributor on the team.
Yeah, they played Washington.
Exactly.
And Mason was a goalie, right?
Yeah, Mason was insane down the stretch that year.
Right.
And one of the more underrated goalies of the Flyers era, aside when he got in his own head, of course. But all this to say is that when they had Simmons and Mark Strite kind of wearing letters, it felt like Giroux was insulated by quality veterans. Like Mark Strite was kind of like a Chemo Timonen light. That's how he struck me a bit as a leader and how he played on the ice. Not in the same tier at all as Chemo, but like of that cloth, the same cut from the same cloth. And when those two guys moved on, specifically Simmons, and you turned it over to guys like Provorov and Voracek and the newcomer Kevin Hayes, and I don't want to crap on Kevin Hayes here because he was also a newcomer of that team. He didn't come from that same era of Giroux and Voracek. It just felt like you had a group of players that were contagious in the wrong ways. And I often, like, I speculate a lot. Like, if you were guys like, Scott Lawton or Travis Konechny or Travis Sanheim, and you wanted to step up, but you looked across the dressing room and you still saw Giroux, you still saw Voracek, you still saw Provorov, like maybe you were going to be a bit hesitant to lead by example or try and say something in the room. And I think you've seen now that as of today, if you were asking me who the next captain of that team is or should be, I would venture to say that it probably should be Travis Konechny. Just to
Konechny or Couturier, either one.
And I do think it's fair to point out that Couturier wore a letter in 1920 and he was not of that same ilk. But I mean, Couturier was probably felt a bit buried, right? Behind guys like Voracek and Provorov, and Hayes had a big personality. And I think that Couturier's presence this year has shown on and off the ice. So, I mean, I just think that what we've seen from this team this year, that a lot of their additions were via subtraction, kind of shows that there was a major intangible problem off the ice.
I don't doubt that. Couturier is like the conscience of the team. Maybe he's not captain material. Maybe it should be Konechny, but either one is better than the alternative because those other guys, just that group just wasn't built to win. You retweeted something that reflected, I believe, the commitment of the players and the coaching of John Tortorella and, of course, Brad Shaw. When they were going through this winning streak, Mike Kelly keeps numbers for the NHL and talked about what the Flyers are doing with regard to odd man rushes, breakaways, first and odd man rushes, first in breakaways, first in rush chances, second in rush goals, and first in goals scored within 10 seconds of forcing a turnover. This is a team, and this is emblematic of a team that is looking to pounce and it is up on their skates, has active sticks, is ready to convert in transition. And this is something that the Flyers have always had against them. And you didn't see a lot of this. And this is everything that John Tortorella coaches.
I mean, it's the process, right? And I think that going back, years now, save for that 6-month period right before the pandemic, it's been the process of this team that really went in the toilet, where you had talented players, but like even in, the 2021 shortened season, like that team, yes, the back end, there was a massive hole with Niskanen gone, but you still had Claude Giroux, Jake Voracek, Sean Couturier, Travis Konechny. They weren't as bad as they should have been. And I think that was a common theme for a lot of years of the Flyers, going back to the Hextall era under Dave Haxtall, where they weren't great, but they weren't as bad as the process showed them to be. And now it's the reverse, where you look at this team that, save for Travis Konechny, they probably don't have a player that could be a top line forward on any given team. And save for, well, maybe now it's different with Jamie Drysdale, but before that acquisition didn't have a defenseman that should be on a top pairing on any given team, maybe save for Travis Sanheim. And all of a sudden they're one of the top defensive teams. They're one of the best penalty killing teams. Maybe they're not generating as many high danger chances as you'd like, but they're good off the rush and they're good territorially. And it's all through hard work. And I will say that, I think there's a reason why you hung on to guys like Scott Lawton, and you brought in a guy like Garnet Hathaway, because they are guys that could give you quality depth and provide like a different element while also being just better players on the ice than, let's say, the alternatives like a Nick Delorier or whoever that, or a Wade Allison. But I think the overall depth of this team and just the work ethic, the buy-in, and it just seemed like they're all gelled into one. You like, look, Konechny's cut above, Couture's kind of cut above, and then you have the guys on the lower end like Paling and Hathaway, but you have like 8 or 9 forwards on this team that are all kind of like all mashed in the same tier, right?
Yeah,
especially
it may be going towards the Konechny tier pretty soon. We'll see.
Who's this?
Owen Tippett.
Oh yeah, Tippett too. Like Tippett, I think it's weird. Like I thought that after the holidays, I'm just like, okay, maybe he capped out as just like a 25, 50 goal guy, but now he turned it up to a notch. But yeah, Tippett is kind of bumping himself up there. Joel Farabee has been awesome the last month or so. Like it feels like every game he registers a point or two. Morgan Frost, since he got healthy scratch, has turned it up a notch, and he shows why so many people like Dan Silver were high on him coming out of the OHL. Then, even Cam Atkinson, like I've been very critical of Cam Atkinson, but since he got healthy scratch, all of a sudden, at least he's noticeable on the ice now. Like it just seems that any given night you have someone going. Now, there are some guys who hit a wall. Obviously, Bobby Brink is back with the Phantoms. Tyson Forster has kind of been a bit slow. Noah Cates coming back from injury. But it's like you don't have any passengers anymore. And I think that's the biggest thing. And the way Bradshaw has rolled the 7 defense rotation on the blue line, the development of Igor Zamula, like it feels like on any given night that you could have a new guy step up and be a big piece for this team. And like, look, when they went on the road trip, when they had the victories against the Winnipeg Jets or the St. Louis Blues, I thought Risto had really good games. Last game was a travesty for him. He was awful last game. But it feels like if Sean Walker isn't going, then Risto will go. If Risto's not going, Sealer will go. Then I find the Jamie Drysdale acquisition has really slotted all the defensemen properly. It feels like they really have a pulse on what this team needs, and they're slowly but surely chipping away at it. And it all has started with that culture set by John Tortorella.
Yeah. No, there's no doubt. I will say, however, I am not a fan of 11-7.
No, me neither.
I look forward to them moving away from that after the trade deadline. And I don't like Drysdale and Cam York together. The Munchkin pair. I mean, they were friends.
Well,
a lot of mobility, but what was that?
One thing I'll say about that, they are, to your point, the Munchkin pair. That's kind of a funny way to put it. But I think that their thought process behind that is that you can load them up with offensive zone heavy draws. And if you look at their size comparables to Taves and Makar, and obviously that's arguably the best pairing in the NHL, but size-wise, they're both comparable to Taves and Makar. I think Taves is 6'1", York is 6', and Makar and Drysdale are both 5'11". So you have to, obviously, Drysdale is far off from Makar and York is far off from Taves, but maybe that's where they're going with. And I think the other part of it is that they like Travis Sanheim on the right side. And if you can have Travis Sanheim on the right side, and let's talk about a world post Sean Walker here, because I think that's where eventually this is heading. If you have York and Drysdale as like a pairing that eats a lot of offensive zone minutes and they can kind of develop together, and York is better defensively than maybe we gave him credit for, and they could be an offensive heavy, puck moving pair, then maybe you pair Zamula with Travis Sanheim as like a shutdown type of pair. And then your third pair is Nick Seeler and Ristolainen, who kind of can flex as a shutdown pair, and they've had good history together going back to last season. Maybe that's where you want to go heading down into the deadline, or you flip flop Seeler and Zamula, and you have Seeler pair with Sanheim as a top shutdown pair, and then Zamula and Risto could be that third pair that just pick up the slack of the Seelers and the Sanheims. So I get the trepidation, and so do I, with pairing York and Drysdale. But I think that if they move forward with that, that's kind of like the thought process behind it.
No, I can see that. I'd be wary of lacking mobility with Zamula. Zamula does not have really good recovery speed.
Yeah.
At this time, maybe he'll get he'll improve in that way. Neither does Ristolainen for that matter, but he's better than Zamula. So that's why I would want a swifter partner with each. But look, the Flyers will work it out. There's no doubt. You mentioned Bobby Brink sent down. Probably should have been sent down a little bit sooner, but he'll get some really quality time with Lehigh Valley, and I'm happy about that. That's for sure. And it looks like Ole Lycksell is going to get a good look-see with the Flyers. At least he'll get about maybe 10, 12 minutes a night, and give him a chance to get out there. I didn't like the three defensemen on the 6-on-5. I didn't understand that. That's where you got when a guy like Lycksell, he's an offensive guy, let him go out there and do that. But I guess, Torts still has that comfort zone. You can still see that if you look back at the way he used to coach. Maybe that's a remnant for what he used to be in New York and especially in Tampa Bay. So I wanted to close with this message and get your thoughts, because, the Flyers have these two games tonight in Detroit, like I mentioned, and the matinee in Boston. Then there was the All-Star game week, and they don't come back to play until February the 6th, which is a Tuesday. And of course, the previous Monday, they're going to have that big London, Ontario police press conference, and that could be a tough moment. But myself, I followed this team since 1969. I've seen a lot. We've been through the ending of the career of Barry Ashby and the Flyers' drive to the Stanley Cup in '74, and then only a few short years later, his life being taken by leukemia. And then, of course, we had the Pelle Lindbergh tragedy. You could say, yeah, Pelle did it to himself, but still, it's painful to see a young man lose his life, and it left a scar with the franchise that lasts to this day. Yannick Dupre in the late 90s, a promising winger, got leukemia as well and passed away at age 24. And Dmitry Tatizhny in 1999, that boating accident. This franchise has been through a lot. And in the end, it's like life itself. You have to go on, and this too shall pass. This franchise is now being run by the right people for the first time in probably a decade. And I want people to enjoy the team, enjoy the experience, and what we've done as fans, enjoying them and appreciating them and their efforts and the organization's consistency and transparency, as we saw with the Gauthier circumstance with the Drysdale, and then their recent announcement just the other day about how they're going to stick with the rebuild. And Briere is out there messaging Hilferty and, of course, Keith Jones, and how important it is that we don't let the circumstances of what's going on in Ontario with Carter Hart and all that bring us down. Because, look, this is a pastime. We're here to enjoy hockey in the Philadelphia Flyers. And they've given us reason, Anthony, to enjoy where they're at and where they're headed in the future.
100%. I mean, and one thing that I'm happy the most about with what Jones and Danny Briere, and you know what, even Dan Hilferty, I mean, obviously he doesn't have his hands on the wheel of the day-to-day roster decision, but I don't think people quite understand how important the change from Camillo and Scott to Dan Hilferty was. And as much as Chuck Fletcher made mistakes and as much as he made a fool of himself a lot of the times in media availabilities, I don't think people quite understand how bad of a situation he was dealing with above him with Dave Scott. I was speaking to someone yesterday and they said like Chuck Fletcher knew this team needed a rebuild and he just wasn't allowed to do it. Now, do I think that he was the right guy to oversee a rebuild? Definitely not. I think that we saw that. But I just want people to understand that, like, if you had Dave Scott as the current CEO and chairman, and he was dealing directly with Danny Briere, I don't think we would be as optimistic. And I think Dan Hilferty coming in, being so willing and eager to reconnect the Comcast side with the Flyers side and the Flyers faithful has been amazing to see. I think Keith Jones deserves a lot of credit in that regard, that he's kind of, along with Hilferty, tried to emulate what Mr. Snyder used to do. You see all those clips of him and Hilferty going into the rooms and shaking the hands of players after every game. And I think that Danny Briere, although he is a former Flyer, he feels like new blood. It's weird. Like, he feels like a modern day general manager. He doesn't feel like a retread. Like, even when Ron Hextall came in, it somewhat felt like a retread, like an old boys club type of hire. I don't get that sense from Danny Briere. Yes, he's a former Flyer, but he's someone who really worked his bag off in the ECHL and coming up the ranks and getting consideration from the Coyotes for the assistant GM job and the Canadians for their GM job. And even Keith Jones, like, I mean, I was very skeptical of that hire. And I think that the way that they've kind of delegated responsibilities, that it's been more of like a partnership between Briere and Jones rather than Jones being Danny Briere's boss. And you've seen Jones deal a lot with media availabilities and messaging and really trying to reestablish this brand, and Danny Briere focusing on the hockey ops side of things. And not to say that Keith Jones has nothing to do with hockey ops, but to your point, it finally feels like the organization is heading in the right direction. And you have guys who understand what this organization have been through and were parts of the organization as players when they were successful. So, and as much as the hockey ops is heading in the right direction, I think that Dan Hilferty deserves his flowers as well, because they have not had a Comcast person represent the team like this ever. Dave Scott never did this. Val Camillo never did this. And obviously Brian Roberts has never been at the forefront with the Flyers. So I think that Dan Hilferty's presence and his willingness to let the Flyers hockey operations build this team the right way, along with trying to bring the not the old school, but the traditional Flyers vibe back, can't be disregarded either.
No, I agree 100%. Anthony, we're gonna wrap it there. Where can people find your work? And if you have anything, I know we didn't get into your Tippett article. It just seemed to be overtaken by events. To check out your latest on the Tippett re-sign attempts by the Flyers and what that's going to look like on the fourthperiod.com. I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, so find my work at the Fourth Period weekly on TSN 690, here and there with Jason Martinez when we could find the time to match our schedules, brotherly pod sparingly. But with Owen Tippett, I think that this is something that's going to be locked up probably shortly after the All-Star game. And I would expect it to come in the $6 million average annual value range. And I think that it's going to be a contract with term here. I think it's something that both sides want to get done. And you kind of mentioned it before that Tippett is slowly separating himself from the pack as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And just a reminder that you can find the O&B Puckcast on X at O&B Puck at O&B Puck. We're also on Getter, our backup platform, at O&B Puckcast at O&B Puckcast. And you can find us on a dozen podcast platforms, including Apple, Spotify, iHeart, TuneIn, you name it. We have a YouTube page, just plug in there, O&B Puckcast, a Facebook page, same thing. And we come up. We appreciate you following, subscribing, whatever the platform dictates, because it helps move us up the charts when people are looking for Philadelphia Flyer podcasts. And with that, we're going to say goodbye. And until next time, everybody, chin up. Take care.